Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Topos Institute Colloquium. Today we're pleased and honored to have Matthew Akamatsu from the University of Washington, who will be speaking to us about collective grassroots knowledge generation with lab discourse graphs. So Matt, whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you, Xiaowei, and thank you so much for having me at this colloquium. I've had a couple of great interactions at the Topos Institute, and so I'm really excited to be able to deepen them through this colloquium and other conversations that we'll have subsequently. So like Xiaowei said, my name is Matt Akamatsu. I'm an assistant professor of biology at the University of Washington. And today I'll describe some of the systems and software that our lab has developed and used in order to enable the collective grassroots generation of knowledge within the lab using a tool that we call lab discourse graphs. So first, a little bit about our domain science research. So we are a cell biology and biophysics lab, and we're motivated by this fundamental question about what governs the remarkable transition between non-living molecules, which are depicted in this cartoon on the left. Here's some proteins and some membranes, and living adapting cells, which are shown in a movie on the right. This is a single migrating cell. So the long-term question in the lab is, what are the principles of collective behavior and self-organization that allow us to explain this transition from non-living components to a living adapting cell? And so in order to try to target this sort of systems level question, we build models at various scales and at various levels of formality. And so in particular, we use both quantitative models, which are depicted in this cartoon on the left, as well as conceptual models shown in this diagram of making a theory that's based in evidence and specific claims and hypotheses from experiments and from the literature. And today I'm going to focus on the latter, on our conceptual modeling and the tools that we've built to enable the construction of these evidence-based theories. The other thing I'm going to focus on today is how this tool can help to address some of the systemic challenges that we've observed as scientists, as trainees. And so a big part of this project really is in the realm of meta-science and science activism. Okay, so what are some of those systemic challenges that we are aiming to address? One is the high barrier to entry for scientific research for new researchers. So there's some social science research that came out from a group here in Seattle, which suggested that one of the factors that contributes to when a trainee starts to define themselves as a scientist is when they start to make a research contribution that other members in the lab can use. And in our field, that the one research contribution tends to be a peer-reviewed publication. And the time it takes to publish a paper like that is longer and longer in our field. It's often 5, 6+ years before a trainee has something to show for their work that's public. And so this delay is one of the factors that is contributing to we would call it the attrition of researchers from research that is highly inequitable and is one area we can target in order to increase the breadth and diversity of researchers who are participating in the scientific process at different stages. So the other systematic question and challenge that we're interested in helping to address is what factors contribute to the highest intrinsic motivation for researchers and their ability to share ideas productively with other members in the field. And so we've noticed that the hierarchical structure of labs, for example, is one of the factors that limits this intrinsic motivation. So another set of social science research suggests that 3 factors that contribute to intrinsic motivation are autonomy, purpose, and a sense of expertise. And the sense of purpose tends to be quite high when we're doing basic research, but the sense of autonomy can often be sapped from a trainee through this hierarchical relationship where the PI or the manager is expected to be the font of most ideas, which then get passed along to the researcher. Conversely, you could, or in a similar way, you could also think about how your notes and your knowledge might be also stored in these hierarchical folders and files and are sort of siloed off from each other. And that doesn't match the associative process that our brain uses to store and retrieve knowledge. And so what other structures might be possible, both on the researcher level and on the knowledge level, that would be more conducive to understanding each other, working together, and generating knowledge in a collective manner? The bottom-up approach is highly attractive. So this network diagram depicts sort of the grassroots connection between individual researchers. But without any additional structure, that grassroots organization is hard to scale beyond about this number of people or nodes. So we expect that if we want to be doing more decentralized research, which would be good for autonomy, we might need a coordination layer to facilitate this grassroots approach at a larger scale. Finally, one increasing challenge for the field of science as a whole is that we think that it could use more transparency and reproducibility, particularly in academic science. A great illustration of this point is that I went to find some example for transparency and reproducibility, and found this great summary generated by Google's Gemini, saying that transparency and reproducibility are important for academic research. However, there are several obstacles, including inadequate record keeping, lack of transparency in reporting, obsolete digital artifacts, errors in reproducing other findings, etc. And I thought it was telling and ironic that the source of information for this point came from a large language model. And so I think this points to how a scientific communication might increasingly be produced through large language models or with large language models. So it's increasingly urgent that we have a way to ground the information that we're getting from AI and other methods in hard evidence, in something that we can attribute, but that also helps our own everyday research. And so rather than making transparency and reproducibility an external part of our research process, instead we aim to bake these features into our everyday tools for thought that we're using for making sense of our own research, for trying to figure out what the next key thing to do in our experiments or in our models, so that on a structural level, these tools for thought help us advance our research and also benefit science as a whole from the level of transparency and reproducibility. So our overall hypothesis is that new collaboration tools can facilitate both cultural and organizational change. And the main approach that we use is to break research into modular parts that can be shared and cited individually. So the first things that we aim to facilitate with the tool that I'll describe is to make it easier to onboard onto a new research group, to bookmark gaps in knowledge that help to motivate new experiments or a new direction for a model, the coordination and collective sense-making between researchers, both within a lab and between labs on the scale of a field, as well as the regular exchange of discretized results between researchers at a scale that's much faster and more granular than a traditional research article. And so the way that we facilitate these four elements is to decompose scientific arguments into its atomic elements, which are questions, claims, and evidence. So this approach for scientific argumentation comes from a science philosopher, Stephen Toulmin, whose main thesis is that science, rather than being organized as a series of monolithic truths, instead is a series of claims that are backed by more or less evidence, such that the textbooks have the best claims, but then over time, more evidence arises, and then those claims get updated, and the textbook gets updated. And this project as a whole started during the pandemic as a remote collaboration with a human-computer interaction researcher at the University of Maryland named Joel Chan. And I started out as a user of a plugin that he was developing for the software that I'm presenting on right now, that we've then ran with, and now we have this ongoing 4+ year collaboration to build tools for thought baked into our everyday research and research communication process. Okay, so once we've decomposed the scientific process into questions, claims, and evidence, we then connect these elements into a graph, which we call a discourse graph. So this is the core model from which we'll be organizing our research. So what is a discourse graph? A discourse graph looks like this, where you have the research question that is the unknown that you're trying to make known through your research. The claim is our proposed answer to the question based on what you know right now, and that claim is supported by one or more pieces of evidence. And each piece of evidence is a specific observation or a result that has a single outcome and a single provenance. So the piece of evidence might have come from a specific research article. It might have come from a specific study or experiment or intervention. And that's the source material at the bottom. And then it's a graph such that at least the evidence can support or oppose a given claim. And so that you build up over time claims that are backed by more or less, more or fewer pieces of evidence. Okay, so what's an example of this discourse graph scheme? For example, what if we have this question, what is the fastest land animal? You might claim that the fastest land animal is the cheetah, and there's some apocryphal measurements out on Google, and if you ask ChatGPT, that turn out to not have been particularly accurate after people went and looked at the methods for the estimates that people were making for the speed of a cheetah. So what kind of hard evidence do we have to help to nail down what the speed of a cheetah could be? Well, it turns out that somebody made a rigorous measurement of the speed of a cheetah, which is shown here. So in 1965, somebody stapled a piece of raw meat to the back of a Jeep and used a stopwatch and a track of a defined length in order to measure the speed that this particular cheetah ran over 3 successive runs. And so he determined that cheetah ran at a speed of about 64 miles an hour. And this paper is great because the methods are very specific. They say things like, at the time, the researcher was an athletics coach, and so was very well versed in the use of stopwatches, and the wind was very light, and all this other thing that you would want to know to be able to contextualize this specific result. And so we see this piece of evidence as supporting an ongoing claim if we want to say that cheetahs are the fastest land animal. Now we have a basis for other people who are interested in the same question to argue with us. If they say, no, I think that zebras are the fastest land animal, they better come with some hard evidence that helps to support their claim as strongly as this particular piece of evidence does. And so that schema has been very useful for us to synthesize existing knowledge from the literature at first, and then I'll tell you about the application we're using for ongoing research. Okay, so how do you put this schema into practice? This is largely thanks to the plugin that Joel developed as part of his research program that we've also been running with. So this app that I'm using to present right now is called Roam Research, and we built a plugin within Roam Research to enable synthesis with discourse graphs. Roam Research is a graph-based note-taking app, meaning that the pages, rather than being organized in folders and subfolders and files, are instead connected non-hierarchically in a graph format. So they're bidirectional links between pages, for example, that let you navigate freely between pages. And so we introduced the schema to this graph notebook in order to allow researchers to generate nodes of those three types, to do synthesis, which I'll describe, and for a team to share a single notebook and collaborate on sense making. So I'll show an example for how we're synthesizing existing literature using discourse graphs in order to inform the choice of parameters in our computational and agent-based models. Okay, so for example, let's look at a canvas meant to illustrate these different elements of the discourse graph. So here I have a schematic of the thing that we're trying to model, which is a piece of the cell's membrane and some proteins that can apply force on the membrane and deform it. And to build these models in a quantitative manner, we need to know what the best available measurements are for, let's say, the rates at which this orange protein can associate with this red protein, etc. So we might have this open question: what is the binding rate of this protein to the other protein? And there are a couple of claims about what the sort of consensus value is, the rate constant of association. And that's grounded in a particular measurement that was made in an experiment. So here's the piece of evidence, which we could open up and look at in more detail. So some key aspects of this evidence page are that it contains the key figure of that summarizes the measurement. You have the observation and the method, and you have whatever contextual information about the methods that might be necessary to be able to interpret this measurement. So this discrete evidence page in many cases can substitute for the long form publication, given that we're aiming to build this model up targeted towards this question about what this association rate is. And then in this graph plugin, we can also link back to the original source material, which in this case is a research article. And we could go back and read it, have more free-form notes, with the idea being that this is a way for us to organize our thoughts, but then also share the most salient observations with our future selves and with other people in the lab. And the other aspect of this canvas that you notice is that there are these relationships between the evidence and the claim. So there's a supporting relationship, there's an informing relationship between claims and questions. So this is one way in which this approach would let us build up our scientific arguments and our models in an extensible and modular way. And so that was great for getting up to speed on the state of knowledge for the existing literature, which I realized wasn't the thing that I was spending most of my time on while I was a postdoc. Instead, most of my time was being spent on original research, where I was in the lab, I was running simulations, and I was really curious whether this schema would help me to structure and guide my ongoing research. And so the aha moment of this project was, well, what else am I doing in the lab and with my simulations aside from collecting new pieces of evidence that help to support my ongoing conclusions that I want to write up and put into a paper. And since I was transitioning into running a lab, I thought, wouldn't it be great if the lab was organized around the schema so that we could crowdsource the research process for a particular research question? So you can imagine different people with different expertise and backgrounds contributing different types of evidence to support our overall claim that we want to make for our research question. And in order to help sort of distinguish the pieces of evidence that are coming from the effort of our research lab, we give that evidence a different name. We call it a result. That semantically is equivalent to a piece of evidence, but came from not something published, but an original experiment that we did. And then the claim, depending on whether it is untested or has been tested, we either call a hypothesis or a conclusion. So now you could imagine once we have a question that we determined is an open question because we've done our synthesis about the state of knowledge up until now, we say, okay, now we have a claim that we want to make that's not supported yet. We'll call that a hypothesis, and that's going to motivate the generation of new results. So how does that look like in the sort of process of our research? That's schematized in this plot of these discourse elements as a function of structure and effort, where the long-term goal is to build a model or a theory of our particular cell biological process. And as we go along, we are attempting to make the best claims that we can based on our current results, which come from experiments. But almost always, we want to make a stronger claim, but we realize that it's not as supported by evidence as we would like it to. So because it's not fully supported, let's call it a hypothesis, as in something that we want to test further. And that hypothesis becomes the motivation for a new experiment or analysis that either we would go back and do in the lab, or we would save for later for ourselves, or even for somebody else who's interested in the same question. And when we save that piece of that potential experiment for later, we call that an issue. We think it's sort of analogous to a GitHub issue, except in this case, it is a request for experiments. And then once you collect a series of issues, then you have a series of the next key experiments to do to support your ongoing claims for your research question. Okay, so I'll show how we apply this in our own lab. First, I'd like to acknowledge the people who are both developing and using this discourse graph software for science. On the left are the developers. This is Joel, David Vargas, Michael Gartner, and Sid Yadav, who these are all developers who have been working on the discourse graph plugin itself. And over the last few years, we've been funded by a series of groups who are currently funded, most recently by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Navigation Fund. And then on a weekly basis, we feed updates to the plugin to the user base, which is our cell biology lab. There are 10 of us now, and we've been in existence for a little over 2 years. And we both benefit from the plugin and then provide feedback nearly every week to help to tailor the development and the user experience so that it's immediately useful to trainees and to all of us in the lab. And as I'll describe later, we're also hiring more developers as we're scaling up this project for more use cases and more users. Okay, so what does this look like in practice for our lab? Let me show for example, a running list of recently created discourse nodes in the lab that are sorted by day. And because I'm showing you this Rome research graph, our lab's knowledge base is embedded into the graph, so we can show you views into it. So for example, this graduate student is collecting evidence for their thesis prospectus, and for this particular paper is making some commentary about this key result tied to this specific paper with some contextual information and their own commentary about how strongly that piece of evidence actually supports the claims that the authors were making. Or, for example, let's look at a result created by an undergraduate who recently joined the lab that's sort of summarized in this single plot that encapsulates the main result and is also tied to the source information, which in this case, rather than being a paper, is an experiment. So the source material is now essentially an extended lab notebook entry from which you can generate new results, for example. And one of the key aspects of the plugin is to make it straightforward for us to be generating these results and these graphs as we go along in our everyday research process. And that's, for example, to take an existing sentence that we have generated, with in an unstructured way, and to be able to quickly convert it into one of these types of discourse elements, and then on the back end, it'll get connected into a graph based on context, like what page it was created in. So for that reason, we have this nice running list of nodes, questions, claims, evidence, results. On the scale of, we have over 1,400 of them created over the last 2 years in the lab. And this really constitutes the entirety of the key knowledge that the intellectual work that we've done over the course of those 2 years. You can visualize the evolution of our lab graph by depicting each individual page as a node in a graph diagram, and then watch it grow over the course of 2 years. So each red dot is one of these evidence pages. A yellow dot is a question page, and a green dot is a claim or a hypothesis or a conclusion. And all the lines correspond to unstructured links, bidirectional links between the pages. And you can imagine that there's another layer of semantic connections between these nodes that correspond to like a supports or informs or opposes relationship that is sparser and more targeted than this general connection. But I think this animation of the lab graph nicely illustrates the organic nature of its growth, and one of the many types of connections and ways that you could navigate from one side of the graph to the other. But it certainly illustrates that our knowledge is no longer organized in this very sort of hierarchical top-down approach. Instead, its associative organization better matches the way that we would be generating ideas in the first place in this much more associative manner.
Matt, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is a really cool depiction of the claims and evidences and questions. I noticed there's like a halo of unconnected points around. Are they independent results that people are still working on and trying to find connections to things in the center?
Yeah, let's actually look at some examples of that, because some of them probably have connections that are not depicted Rome calls them orphans, that are not depicted here. But okay, let's zoom in
Mm.
and say like, okay, this result, I think probably the page that originally referenced it has been deleted. And
Ah.
so it no longer has any context, you could say.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so I wonder for that particular result if there is a analogous one that exists now. So let's look at rack1 RNA seq. And it looks like, yeah, so there's one that doesn't
Mm.
have any back references, and there's one that does, that we would go back and merge ourselves.
Mm.
Um,
Very
and
cool.
so
Yeah.
then, this one actually is connected in.
I mean,
So
we should be expecting a lot of these kinds of nodes if people are using it, the tool for uploading the ideas and looking for connections maybe later on.
yeah,
And another question is that I noticed that in your animation, some of the nodes were clustered together. Are they somehow semantically similar, or related, or is the clustering just some artifact of the animation?
yeah. So for that particular animation, uh, the red nodes, for example, were clustered by the tag itself, the evidence tag, and so
Hmm.
by definition, they would show up as clustered together in a way that is less apparent in this particular animation. Um, we have started to store these pages in a vector database so that we can do some sort of semantic similarity search across the nodes,
Hmm.
which is at a pretty early stage. And so I think there's a lot of potential for us to be able to have this graph representation be more informative of relationships, whether they're knowledge relationships, semantic relationships. That as depicted here, um, it's a pretty like arbitrary linkage from one page to another.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's very exciting. The work with the vector database. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to field other questions if they pop up.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you to unmute. So thanks, man.
Mhm. So if that animation helps to give us a sense of the scale of the graph, it also, I think, helps to show how important it is to do synthesis and to make sense of the elements of the graph. Because if that was the only way that we could visualize or organize those elements of knowledge, then it would be very hard to make sense of. So we spend a lot of time developing different sense-making approaches that take advantage of these modular pieces of information, so that they help to orient us and help us collaborate with each other. So for example, one activity that happens in the lab is that we have a synthesis day or um, even a synthesis retreat where we spend where we go somewhere, take a query of all of the discourse nodes that we've created over the course of the year, and then try to synthesize them onto a freeform canvas. So let's look at an example of that. So here is a lab manager and staff scientist who's making sense of this question about how multiple cells can self-assemble into a higher order structure, which is called a luminoid because it has a lumen on the inside and has a very sort of specific geometry. And so in order to advance the research question about how these are assembled, we start with the question, we build up the evidence uh, that helps to inform what the state of knowledge is about the question, and then end in a couple of new hypotheses to test. Um, and then as she generates new results, then they can be they're stored here, and then they can become part of a future paper or other way to make sense of this information. So for example, let's look at this result here, which is sort of microscopy data tied to a specific experiment, which again has sort of the granular lab notebook level information accessible if you want to look at all the nitty-gritty details. Here's some nice GIFs of the movies. But the assumption is that if you're interested in the take-home message from this experiment, you can just look at the result. You can look at the key figure and any grounding information, and that's sufficient to follow along. And for the purpose of organizing the project, laying it out in this free-form canvas is one way in which people in the lab can track their experiments and their ongoing work. And having targeted queries of which of these nodes to drop into the canvas is the other key element. So another way that that this is benefiting us is to crowdsource the research process by handing off individual elements of a project to another member of the lab in a way that is more self-organized than the traditional top-down approach. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I had mentioned that if you have an analysis or an experiment that you think is the next key thing to do, but you may not have time to do it at that moment, you store it as an issue. And so now we have a dashboard of issues, which are also potential starter projects for people who join the lab. So you might have analysis projects, experiments, that both give you some information about the analysis itself, but also lets you navigate through the graph about what connections did the issues tie to, so that you can find the original context and motivation for generating this issue in the first place. So for example, in this meetings page, the student and I were trying to understand these plots that he had made. And so said, well, it'd be really nice if we had a metric for quantifying X, Y, and Z. This doesn't mean that because we had the idea, the student needed to do that right now, but we'll save that for later. And he or somebody else can do it. And just by reading through the available information in the issue and connected pages, you as a new researcher would be able to get up to speed on why you would be doing something, who you should talk to, and how to get started. So we've used this issues board successfully with a couple of undergraduates as ways to start their projects.
Matt, we have a question in the chat. Yanis is asking, does your platform allow for detection of protocol or procedural conflicts, inconsistencies in the prescribed methodologies, and so on?
So there is space to be able to implement those kinds of inconsistencies. So right now, on the scale from formal to formal sort of graphs, we're skewing towards the informal, but I expect that the content in the graph would be sufficient to be able to start to highlight some of these inconsistencies. So right now, for example, you could take a claim and say, like, is there both supporting and opposing evidence? That's like a query that's already built in. Or do you have a piece of evidence that is supporting multiple claims that aren't consistent with each other? All of that is possible, which is not something that we're implementing regularly yet.
Okay, thanks.
But as the graph grows, it'd be really fun as a way to highlight where the key elements are that are missing. So I mean, the closest that we have is this dashboard, which a researcher could use to help point them selves towards, for example, an open question, which means like a question that doesn't have like a summary or an answer yet, or looking for a like a claim that you've made, see if anybody's like contributed evidence that doesn't actually support your claim, for example. But as the graph grows and there's less shared context with people who are using the same graph, it'll be increasingly important to have these higher level coordination mechanisms. Okay, so let's look at an example of how this issue is created and used in practice. The other element of the issue that I didn't highlight was that at the bottom you could claim it, and the issue gets converted into a new experiment that gets you up and running on your project and is already connected into the graph. So we have a student, for example, who just joined a month or two ago, who has claimed 3 different issues and carried out analyses in a pretty self-organized manner. So my favorite is one that showed up last week, in which he was perusing the issues board and found an analysis that sounded interesting to him, that another member of the lab, Adarsh, had generated to save for later. And so Ben went and talked to Adarsh and said, "Hey, this sounds interesting to me. Can you help me get started?" And Adarsh pointed him towards, specific clustering mechanism to start looking at. And all without my knowledge, they carried out this mini project together and ended in a result which was quite clear, saying that, okay, this specific clustering mechanism wasn't necessary for this particular data set, but it'll probably be useful for later. And so that was the first example that I'm aware of in which 2 people in the lab got together without my suggestion or guidance to use this graph structure to guide their knowledge. So that was a very satisfying instance that's suggesting that the structure of the graph itself is helping researchers to coordinate on their own without a PI. Okay, and so in the remaining time, I think I will just advertise without providing any detail that another way we're doing synthesis is to build in a large language model plugin that lets you fill in some of the gaps in being able to follow what somebody else in the graph had generated. So you could get context based on the existing information in the page and the connected pages to get more of the backstory. You could get help generating the discourse nodes if you just have free text that you want to save some of those for later into hypotheses, etc. Or if you want help in generating new hypotheses, then this LLM plugin will use the discourse graph schema to help infer, okay, well, if you have a result, maybe it's time to build a conclusion. If you're running an experiment, maybe it's time to look for a result, and it'll attempt to help you along the way. Okay, and so where are we going from here? One thing I want to share is a quote from a member in the lab about how this system has benefited them. So he said it's been amazing at helping to streamline his thinking. The thought process is quite clear when approaching a new topic to codify existing literature, and helped him have a clear picture of the progress of the project, current data, and what needs to be done. It's also helped him separate out the numerous side directions that emerge from the core ideas we're trying to test by filtering in terms of, is this analysis going to test the hypothesis that we set out? It also provides a sense of direction and satisfaction with the work being carried out it's quite easy to fall into a cycle of questioning the validity or importance of the work, but structuring the results as opposing or supporting hypotheses has helped him to reiterate that the project is moving in a productive direction. So this illustrates how having these substantive artifacts for the original observations that you make as a researcher, even as a trainee, helps to keep you with this sense of satisfaction about your work and to remain oriented to the key elements. So we most recently, in the last couple of weeks, we have launched the next phase of the Discourse Graphs project in order to demonstrate how it can be used more widely by other researchers and research labs. So this user pilot is being funded by both the Navigation Fund and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So if we have a functional plugin in Roam Research, other people prefer different tools for thought, whether that be Notion or Obsidian or something else. And it would be great if they could continue using their favorite note-taking app and yet also have these discourse graph functionalities and a way for their discourse graph to talk with somebody else's. So those are the functionalities that we're aiming to build in to this discourse graph ecosystem over the coming years. We'll also experiment with ways to allow researchers to share individual elements of the discourse graph in a modular way with sufficient context for other people to understand in both a sort of peer-to-peer collaborative way and potentially in a public nano publication framework as well. So the key elements are to have simplified use cases, to have plugins for your favorite tool for thought, and to network the graphs between each other. And like I mentioned before, we're hiring a couple positions, including a full stack engineer and a user experience designer for people who are interested in contributing to this project and bringing and helping to develop accessible discourse graph tooling. So I'm going to jump ahead to a couple of seeds that I want to plant from conversations I had with various people at Topos Institute. Now that discourse graphs are growing, these category theory type approaches will probably be increasingly helpful and potentially necessary in order to keep building this organic knowledge base in a scalable way. So we had talked about maybe creating a discourse translator protocol where, because each lab is creating its own dialect of what a question, a claim, and an evidence and those connections mean, and I've color-coded similar elements between different instantiations of graphs, which Joel uncovered through his user research. It might be important to create a protocol to interoperate between one lab schema and another lab's schema. And you can see this example in a preprint that we have put on the archive. We also, even though I focused on conceptual modeling, we also build quantitative models, particularly agent-based models, where each of these elements and quantities are supported by evidence or have we'd like to be interoperable with models at different scales or from different people. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in having more of a continuum between the informal and formal modeling. And then one idea that came up when I was chatting with ChatGPT about category theory was that would category theory help to propagate credit attribution when somebody's claim is being supported by another piece of evidence. Okay, so in summary, this discourse graph tooling has helped us to create a network of atomic pieces of knowledge that other members of the lab can exchange, cite, and post that might be a complement or an alternative to journal article publishing for collective sense making. For trainees, this has given them a more structured approach to being introduced to a concrete research problem and to make a substantive contribution so that they perceive themselves as a scientist earlier in their training. For the system of science as a whole, we found that the schema of questions, claims, and evidence has been sufficient to serve as the coordination layer for grassroots generation of knowledge that lets somebody's thought process scale within the lab, and as we're testing now, out to collaborators and on the scale of the field as well, in a way that can be grown organically. And then finally, on the scale of the system of science, we're thinking of this metaphor that my collaborator Greg Nelson conceived of, was that rather than having sort of uniform research artifacts and sort of researcher types, we're now building a richer ecosystem in the form of a permaculture of scientific contributors, whether those be students, generalists, synthesizers, amateur researchers, etc. And so in this metaphor, the fruits on these trees are the discoveries generated from our research, and then the root network underneath are the discourse graphs. So thank you for your time. If we'll post a link to this notebook itself, which you can also access through this QR code, so that you can peruse through the notebook too. Thanks a lot.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Oh, I really love your talk. I feel like every time I hear you talk about discourse graphs, I learn something new, especially all the user stories. I think have really grounded, the whole theory of how we can use these things to help advance science. So thank you for that. So now we are entering the questions time of our colloquium. For those who have been here with us before, you know the drill. You can either raise your hand, and then I can call on you to unmute yourself, or you can ask your question in the meeting chat, and I will ask on your behalf. So, I think Yanis had a question that he asked towards the end of your talk. It seems to be it kind of reminds me of what you were saying about credit attribution. So Yanis's question is this: does the platform mandate the tabulation of hours spent on a specific project?
Yeah, so because each of these bullet points has its own timestamp, you can get a quick sense of what the length of time was between, let's say, when somebody started on the project and when the first result came out. And that type of analysis has shown that it's on the scale of several weeks between when somebody joins the lab and when they start generating some sort of result, often from their work. The granular work, the day-to-day work, is sometimes done within the notebook. Sometimes it's done, in a Jupyter notebook or in on a pen and paper lab notebook, and those aren't mandated to be tabulated in the graph. So we're aiming to keep some flexibility in how you're doing your like hour-to-hour work. But then once you have something that you think you want other people in the lab to be able to understand, then it goes into this graph. So our particular implementation is meant to be flexible, and yet be completely transparent in terms of time stamping and knowing who created what. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, Valeria, I see that you have a question.
Oh, hi, Matt. Thanks. That was a very interesting talk indeed. I have two questions. One is just for clarification because I kind of, there are so many nice ideas coming through. I think at some stage you said that there are six elements, six kinds of elements that the dashboards kind of keep track of, kind of things like questions, claims, evidence. But I thought I saw more than six sorts of elements. What exactly kind of comes into the board? So that's clarification question. And the second one is more speculative. It's about, has anyone already tried to use this kind of ideas for more mathematical results? The the motivations that you give and are very much like the motivations that people doing mathematics have. So kind of has anyone kind of tried to use these ideas of claims, evidence, and sources and stuff like that for mathematics?
Yeah, so that question I've only had conversations with people about when I was visiting Topos, so I'm happy
Right.
to talk about that more. So we're thinking about the core schema being just three elements: questions, the claim, and the evidence, and they're having this supporting relationship between the three. And
Right.
then our lab has then forked additional instances of evidence and claims in order to classify the evidence that's coming originally from our lab. And so in terms of a core protocol, we think it's just these three elements.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what we'd like to make more interoperable is that something that I call a result, somebody else in another lab might have a different name for it, but semantically, it's still a piece of evidence. And I was originally envisioning this system working for empirical research
Mm-hmm.
anytime you're collecting evidence. But then in talking with people at Topos, they thought that potentially every time you have a new any type of observation,
Yes.
then it could still be collected in this way. I think for computer science algorithms, for example, you're often benchmarking them against something else, and so you
Mm-hmm.
have a result there. Um, I'm really curious whether it would work for a formal proof. People at Topos thought potentially, and I don't have really a sense one way or the other.
Right.
But I think
Because
it'd be
of course you
fascinating.
can have experiments that are just experiments in pure mathematics. So kind of, you try on us, you try an extra assumption here and see if the theorem still comes true or not. So kind of, I think the notion of experiment is a bit broader than the lab experiments that you were thinking of initially. And simulations are also experiments, right? But so basically it's only the three sort of the questions, claims, and evidence. And we can think about different kinds of evidence and than just articles and ex experiments. Cool. It is lovely. It's a very, very nice idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I were to add to that, I think Terence Tao has a PFR theorem project that he's doing right now, where he's using a software called Blueprint, and Blueprint seems to have a lot of overlapping features with discourse graphs. In Blueprint, you have theorems, and then you can specify the theorems either as a formal, clean formula, or you can write it as in natural language in LaTeX. So you can there are many views of a theorem, and then you have the proofs for each of those theorems, which could also be written in natural language or in a lean formula. And then there are connections between the proofs and the theorems. And then people can visualize which proofs have been done, sorry, which theorems have been proven and which are still requiring more work. So it's been used as a coordination tool. It seems like, Matt, what you're describing here is pretty universal across many scientific domains, requiring some kind of way of visualizing the questions which are out there and the work that needs to be done. Yeah, so thanks for that. I think Dana has a question. Dana, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay. Dana, do you have a question? Would you like to unmute yourself? Okay, maybe later on. So I have a question. So Matt,
Wait, I'm back. I couldn't unmute myself.
oh sure, yeah, please go ahead, Dana. Thanks.
Uh, three quick questions, please. Do you have some tools, or do you feel a need for tools to keep track of people that they're doing the work they're supposed to be doing? Because you have so many people in the lab, and it might be hard to have an overview. Second question is, do you have some experience of remote workers who are not there in the lab, but keeping them part of activity? And then a smaller question is, for making reports, bibliography is always a nightmare. Do you have tools to help with collecting bibliography so people don't waste their time when it comes time to making their reports? Thanks very much for your response.
Of course. Yeah, so in sort of random order, our graph is connected to a shared Zotero database through an open source plugin called Zotero Roam. And so that everybody adds papers to this shared database that you can read from, but then it can also pull individual sources from. So that way everybody can both see what intellectual work has been done on a particular paper, and people are increasingly reusing knowledge from those elements. And they also, you can take the source material and convert it into some sort of like BibTeX. So there's at least a sort of universal depiction of what a source paper is, that we could actually do more work to turn it into LaTeX, for example, from the beginning. But you could also connect that Zotero to your own like LaTeX editor, for example, which we do. In terms of helping to assess the work that people are doing, what we found is that if everybody has a transparent representation of the work that they've done, that helps them to stay motivated themselves. So in like a weekly meeting or in a quarterly sort of dump of their results that they've created, it helps them to picture with less input from me where they're at in their project. So that if we see that there's a hypothesis in an experiment, but there's still no result yet, that helps them to internalize that, okay, the next thing I need to do is to create a result. And so having some sort of like regular sharing of what you have already has really helped with that on the level of intrinsic motivation. And so far we've had hybrid workers using this lab graph. I expect it'll help a lot with remote workers, but we haven't tried yet.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. So we have thanks, Dana, for your questions. We have a question from Janet. Janet, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, hi. Yeah, this is beautiful. And it applies, I think, to any research. And so it could apply to I don't know, any field where you can frame it in terms of research and collaborative research. The use case that I was thinking of that maybe Chan Zuckerberg would be interested in is cleaning up Wikipedia, where there are a lot of claims, but the claims, evidence, and sources are not as coherently linked as they should be. And there are questions about, so you can't see the threads of claims, evidence, and sources. And it's a pretty straightforward use, but it would really be wonderful if that could be taken on. So great work.
Thank you. I'd be especially excited if it started to incorporate evidence that doesn't exist yet, and sort of points to, well, we might have captured the state of knowledge, or that like the evidence is shaky, but what we now have is a list of new evidence that should be collected by somebody, if they're motivated to.
Right. Actually, so within Wikipedia, they have flags for editors saying this claim requires evidence, but it's not as nicely organized so that editors could scan through and see issues like that.
Absolutely.
Right. Thanks, Janet, for your questions. So I think maybe I'll ask one last question before we end the live stream. Matt, if we're very interested in using Discourse graphs for our lab, how do we get started? What's the best way to install this, or how do we get our lab users, lab members to start using this? what's the best way from your experience?
Yeah, I would recommend that you join our user pilot. So we do have a sort of generic fork of this this lab graph that you can download and start using. The onboarding is still somewhat involved, which is what we're targeting with the with this user pilot. And so if you participate in the user pilot, then you have somebody who's sort of tailored, who will be talking with you specifically about your use case, helping people in the lab get onboarded and take feedback to improve the user experience for people. You can, so the discoursegraphs.com is where we have some more background information. We just started a Discord, which I'll put in the chat as well, which will be one way to both learn about updates in the user pilot and to also get involved in having a in having your own graph. So through discoursegraphs.com, you can download an existing Roam Research plugin, but even better, we can tailor one that's more suited to your needs.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I think that's great. So having I didn't realize that your user pilot is already in starting and that we could all participate in that. That's really good news. Well, so let's thank Matt again for amazing talk and for answering our many questions. And I'm now going to end the live stream on YouTube now. Then we are going to fall back to our Zoom chat. Okay, the stream is over. So we are now not being